At the end of World War II, several Hungarian high-ranking military officers and politicians were sentenced as war criminals, then executed. However, not all of them could be put in the same category, at least not with a clear conscience. One of these was General Ferenc Szombathelyi, who had had conflicting opinions and questionable decisions, but in the end remained loyal to his country and refused to side with either murderous ideology. In this video, I take a look at his life from beginning to end, hopefully illustrating why he should not have been put in front of a firing squad. Ferenc Knaus was born in the city of Győr in 1887 to an ethnic German father and a Hungarian mother. He graduated from the cadet school in Pécs, then continued his studies at the Kriegsschule or Staff College in Vienna. He participated in World War I as a young officer, but also joined the Hungarian Red Army in 1919 to defend the country against its neighbors. He briefly contemplated joining the Communist Party, but decided against it as he deemed the Bolshevik attempt to reform Hungary a mismanaged enterprise. He was not deemed guilty for his actions, so once the regime collapsed and the kingdom was restored, he rejoined the Royal Hungarian Army and continued to build his career. From 1926, he taught at the Ludovica Military Academy in Budapest. He was not universally liked, he could be harsh and did not shy away from criticizing even his superiors. He gained several enemies, among them Henrik Wert, future chief of the General Staff. After a few years, he left the academy and joined 3rd Mixed Brigade as chief of staff, where he served until 1933. The following year, he took his mother's maiden name and became Ferenc Szombathelyi to emphasize his Hungarian roots. However, this remained a painful topic. He always felt that many distrusted him because of his mixed background, but also because he was not a member of the nobility. He liked to say that even though his mother was an ordinary woman, she was more noble and gracious than many in the higher classes. In 1936, he succeeded Gustav Jani, future commander of Second Army, as head of the Ludovica Academy. Their relationship quickly soured as Szombathelyi was very outspoken and continued to openly criticize everything that he deemed useless or incorrect. According to Gyula Kádár, who served under both of them, Szombathelyi was much more pragmatic, focusing on the practical. He was talkative, he liked to eat and drink, and to look at attractive women, something the much more reserved Jani would never do. He was not only educated but also knowledgeable. He loved to learn about military history, but also about music and the arts. His analytical mind sometimes reached opposing conclusions. He was a nationalist and did not care about politics. He didn't like that more and more officers were drawn to the far right and the Arrow Cross Party, the Hungarian equivalent of the Nazi Party. He believed that their leader, Ferenc Szálasi, was an idiot, but at the same time, coming from humble roots, he resented that lineage was still an important factor in Hungary. Upon hearing that Regent Horthy wanted to examine the officer's lineage, he complained that they still looked at him with distrust simply because he was not noble born. This was not true, as Horthy himself did trust him until the end. When the pro-German Henrik Wert became chief of the General Staff in 1938, he moved Szombathelyi from the academy to the General Staff to lead Section 1 operations. He would be responsible for planning in case of a conflict, and in this position, before the Munich Agreement, he initially pushed for war against Czechoslovakia and criticized the political leadership which was trying to avoid an actual conflict even after German encouragement. After a few weeks, once he learned the true state of the military forces, he was deeply disappointed. He now claimed that Hungary had no army with which to fight, that there had been no serious development, so the only option was to lurk in the shadows and stay out of a major war that could easily expand and doom the country. The following year, he took command of 8th Corps, which was then expanded with Rapid Corps to become the Karpat Group in June 1941. He led this formation for a few days in Operation Barbarossa before it was disbanded, but then, after a short hiatus, in the fall of 1941, he succeeded Henry Quert, who was forced into retirement. As chief of the General Staff, he remained skeptical about German prospects. He doubted that Hitler could win the war, but also believed in the German soldier. Because of this, he was looking for a way out, trying to keep Hungary's reserves for the final phase of the conflict, when maintaining internal order would become the primary objective. However, he was also fearful of a German reaction, so he deemed any serious and direct move towards the Allies risky and premature. In early 1942, news arrived about partisan movements near Újvidék, Novi Sad, after which Szombathelyi ordered the military to restore order. This resulted in the infamous Újvidék massacre, in which more than 3,000 civilians were murdered. Szombathelyi first defended his military officers and gave them awards, blaming the gendarmes for the atrocities, but once he learned the true extent of the killings, he set up a military court which eventually gave a guilty verdict. However, the defendants escaped to Germany and later returned with the occupation forces or outright joined the Waffen-SS. In September 1942, Szombathelyi visited Second Army at the front. In private, he had a very negative outlook, but tried to reassure the public while asking for German assistance. After Second Army's defeat, he felt that the time had come to minimize Hungary's participation in the war, but he was unable to deny further German requests. Nonetheless, in early 1943, he was ready to send a liaison officer to the Western Allies until Prime Minister Kálai put an end to these efforts and directed the soldiers to stay out of political affairs. He felt like being locked in a dark room, not knowing what the politicians were planning. Cooperation with the Soviet Union was out of the question. The only possible option for him, and for Kálai and many others, was reconciliation with the Western Allies and eventual occupation by British or American troops. The question was, how realistic was this desire? To placate the Germans, he was willing to remove all occupation divisions from the Soviet Union and send units to the Balkans instead, but the politicians prevented this as well, fearing eventual combat with Allied troops that would land in the region. At least in early 1944, they managed to smuggle Soviet partisan leaders to Budapest and made a pact with them to stop all hostilities between Hungarian occupation forces and some partisan units in Ukraine. They started building a relationship with the Slovak military intelligence, but they did not have time to achieve anything before the German occupation, which came in March 1944. As they were very distrustful of Szombathelyi and his close colleagues, he was placed under house arrest and then retirement a month later. This was undeserved because he was one of the military leaders who had convinced Horthy that resistance to German occupation was futile, and as chief of the General Staff, he had focused solely on the Soviet threat, ignoring or trivializing any signs of a possible German move against Hungary. In October, after the Nazi takeover, he was arrested and deported to Germany, where he was eventually taken into custody by the Americans. However, they turned him over to Hungary shortly thereafter. After a brief trial, he was stripped of his rank and convicted by the new People's Court to life imprisonment. This was not the end of the story though, as the new government, without any semblance of legality, extradited him to Yugoslavia, where another trial followed in Novi Sad. Tito's government wanted to take revenge for the 1942 atrocities and for the occupation as well. They couldn't get Horthy himself, but on the 4th of November 1946, Szombathelyi was executed, along with actual war criminals who had orchestrated the Újvidék massacre and gave false reports to him. Generals Feketehalmi Zeidner and Grassi, Colonel Deák, and Captain Zöldi. After the fall of the communist regime in 1994, the new Supreme Court annulled the original Hungarian verdict and he was rehabilitated.